I'm Kelly McCutchen with the Georgia Public Policy Foundation, and I'm going to be the moderator today. We've got a wonderful panel for you with great knowledge of a lot of different perspectives, and I'm going to give them a short introduction. They're each going to talk for about 10 minutes, and hopefully we'll have a lot of questions and some answers. First of all, Scott Hodge with the Tax Foundation. You heard Steve Moore refer to them. They are, I think, the oldest organization in the country that has been researching taxes and its implications from a policy perspective and doing just a tremendous job, have great credibility. And Scott is the president of the Tax Foundation. We appreciate you coming down from Washington and being with us today on a Saturday. Second, A.D. Frazier has had a wonderful business career, and he now has been tapped using his great knowledge. He was put on the Tax Council, and they decided to make him chairman. I don't know if I offer my congratulations or condolences, but he's done a wonderful job so far. We look forward to him talking to us about the process that the Tax Council has gone through. And Clint Mueller is with ACCG, and many times we forget that when we discuss tax policy, it has an impact on our local governments. And they are many times put in a very difficult position, and it's important for us to understand those impacts for the local governments. And so Clint is going to give us that perspective and some ideas on maybe some reform at the local level that we can pursue. So I'm going to start off, and let Clint Mueller start us off. Clint?
Thank you, Kelly. I appreciate you all taking the time out of your busy schedules today. I know it's a beautiful day outside and we're inside, but I hope you get something out of this panel today. And obviously when we're talking about tax issues, especially after lunchtime, that is not the most interesting topic in the world to talk about. I find it interesting myself, which probably shows you what a sick individual I am. But it is very important. Obviously, you've heard a lot today about what we can do to improve the economic development climate in the state of Georgia. And the tax structure is critical in laying that foundation. And of course, when we hopefully come out of this recession, and I believe we're on our way out now. I think the revenue numbers have been looking a lot better for the past few months. But Georgia needs to position itself to take advantage of the growth it's enjoyed not only in the past, but hopefully the growth that we can continue to enjoy and maybe pull from some of those states like, I think the speaker at lunch talked about people moving out of California to Texas. Maybe we should be moving to Georgia. So just real briefly today, I want to talk a little bit about tax policy and how it particularly impacts the economic climate in our state. And one of the things that we always hear when we're talking to people across the state is the issue of fairness. I think that topic comes up over and over again. We want a fair tax or a system that's fair. Fairness is really in the eye of the beholder. If you ask 20 different people what they consider to be fair, they'll give you 20 different answers. I'd like to argue, though, today that there's a couple key components of good tax policy that I think go a long ways to creating fairness in the state. And I'm going to talk a little bit about tax equity, and I'm going to talk a little bit about trust and transparency in taxation. In regards to equity, we have to have a system in the state that puts people on a level playing field. That's not just for businesses, but also for individuals. And I think it's important that we take a hard look, and I know the Tax Council is doing this right now, but anything that creates distortions in the tax code, and when you get into exemptions, special assessments, different types of credits, I know those things are very politically popular and they have their interest groups that support them, and there's usually a lot of good reasons for those, but we have to be very careful when we create these distortions. Over time, what that does is it just shifts tax burden around, and again, there may be good reasons to shift tax burden from one segment of society to another, but when we do that, and pressure builds on the segment that is not exempt, they scream louder and they demand special treatment for themselves. And so what we do is we just create this system where we just keep shifting the burden around, and that really, over the long haul, doesn't do any of us any good. Sales tax compliance is another area that we are looking at strongly. I know the General Assembly this year had several measures that they took up dealing with compliance. But if the system that we have, if there's a feeling out there that you're paying your share but your neighbor's not, and your neighbor's not likely to be caught, then it makes it hard for you to pay your share. Think about businesses that are competing, and you've got one business for whatever reason is not collecting the sales tax that they should be collecting. A 7% advantage that they have is huge, especially in retail. So we're doing a lot in the area of trying to ensure that everybody is paying their fair share, especially in the area for us with sales tax compliance. One of the things that was passed this year, House Bill 1093, was allowing us to start matching our occupation tax databases against the sales tax registration databases. We have a lot of different databases in government at the state level. You know, the Secretary of State's office has different databases on businesses. DOR has databases. We do at the local level. But none of them talk to each other. And we're not sharing information like we should. So I think it's important that going forward in the future that the local governments working with the state start finding ways to, especially in the information age that we live in, and the ability to share this stuff and compare it electronically. We need to do more of that. Streamlined sales tax. This has become a hot topic nationally, but we really put our Georgia businesses at a huge competitive disadvantage to businesses that don't have a presence here in our state but are selling products into our state. We've got to get a handle on this issue long term. It's not fair that your bricks and mortar businesses here in the state have to collect the sales tax when their competitors don't reside here, don't provide a lot of the benefit that your local businesses do here, do not have to collect that sales tax. So I know that 1221 was passed last session, and we're working to get approved by the National Streamlined Sales Tax Compact right now, and we'll see where we're at before the next session, but I'm hoping that we can become a full member of that. In regards to new technologies, we're seeing a lot, especially in the telecom arena, about different types of emerging technologies, and the tax treatment is different based on the technology. And you and I, the consumer, we receive a service, and we really don't care necessarily how we receive the service. We're looking at the price of that service, and is the service quality service. But you take your TV service, we have satellite service and cable TV service and a lot of internet now based services. So there's all these different technologies that are being used to provide the service, but they're all being taxed differently. So we really have to go in and now and create a tax structure that creates a level playing field amongst our telecom companies, I believe. And that's something that I think that I know ACCG will be looking at, and looking at maybe moving to more of a telecom excise tax, replacing a lot of the different types of taxes that telecom companies currently pay with one streamlined, simpler tax. When it comes to transparency, there seems to be a lack of trust right now amongst the public in how government spends their tax dollars. The trauma care fee that was on the statewide ballot here in Georgia, I think, is a good example. We talked to several people after that failed and said, you know, why didn't you vote for it? And most everybody that we talked to said they were 100% in favor of addressing the issue of the lack of adequate trauma facilities in several areas of our state. But what they told us is said we didn't trust the government to take that $10 that we were going to pay and actually put it to that use. Now, we know that for the trauma care, there was a lockbox created. It was a constitutional amendment. But again, I think the perception out there is that in the past, a lot of these fees and things that have been paid have not gone to the intended purpose. And there's a lot of taxes and fees that aren't transparent. In other words, people are paying them, but they don't know they're paying them. And I think that one of the things we've got to do in government to gain back the trust of the citizenry is we've got to be more transparent. I look at some of the SPLOST referendums around the state. A lot of them are not passing by the wide margins that they used to pass by. It's still a very popular tax because you're telling the voters what they're getting, but I think a lot of voters are saying, but you never told me what the operational costs were going to be. It was nice that I knew that I was going to get these capital projects done, but I didn't realize you were going to go up on my property tax to pay for operations. So I think that in the areas of transparency, we need to make sure that the fees, such as the prepaid 911 fees, solid waste trust fund, hazardous waste trust fund, peace officer prosecutors training fund, just to name a few, that those fees go to what they were designated to go to. And right now, a lot of these fees are not going to those designated purposes. Enterprise funds. A lot of times governments siphon off their enterprise funds to support general operations, and that becomes a hidden tax in your utility bills. Franchise fees, again, another hidden tax in your utility bill. Insurance premium tax, we all pay that, but you don't see that. There's lots and lots of these taxes and fees that aren't visible, and I think that we've got to do a better job of making sure that there's more visibility there, again, to win back the trust of the voters. Lastly, I'd like to say that at the local level, we are very different from county to county. We've got 159 counties in Georgia. In my opinion, we've probably got too many local governments in this state, but it's what we have right now. But each one's different, and the economies are different across the state. The rural counties don't operate like the more urban counties, and the tax structure in one county doesn't necessarily fit in another county. And I think that there needs to be more flexibility at the local level to design the tax structure that meets the needs of those constituents that live in that area. In other words, if I'm in the Savannah area, I may want to be a little bit more sales tax based in my tax structure because of all the tourism and able to bring in revenue from other people. But in some areas of the state, not a lot of sales tax is generated. So I think that's something that we have to look at in trying to provide more flexibility across the state for our local governments. Again, working for ACG, we feel like the closer the government is to the people, the better it is, and the more accountable it is. So we encourage the services to be provided locally, and for the local citizens to be able to know exactly what they're getting for those tax dollars that they're paying. With that, Kelly, I'll turn it over to you and be glad to answer any questions at the end.
Thanks, Clint. AD?
If you don't mind, I'm going to sit down. After you, Clint, I don't think I need to say anything. I have had the pleasure for the last 5 months, seems like a lifetime, to chair the Georgia Council on Tax Fairness. There are 11 of us, 4 economists, well-known economists, all local. That means you start off with 8 opinions. And then there's 7 others of us who are mere mortals, including the governor. 2 were appointed by Casey and 2 were appointed by Dave Ralston, and 2 were put in the bill by name. Several of my colleagues are here today. I know 2 of them are here because I saw them, Skeeter McCorkle and Brad Dixon. Stick your hands up, fellas. Yeah, there they are. Right. They're going to try to sneak out early so you don't shoot them. Roger Tutterow and Christine Reese, are you both here? There you go. They're 2 of our economists, and they're the really smart ones. When we were given our charge as the Tax Commission, we were told to see if we could make the tax code more business friendly. Over the past 5 months or so, we've held 12 town hall meetings, probably attended by 2,000 or so people and probably over 200 speakers. If you want to know what they said, just look on our website, and every single speaker who presented their comments are there. Here's some of the things that come to mind. And Clint has presented with us before, and Kelly has too. Tax policy is probably not the most important issue for a company that's going to locate in Georgia. In fact, when we ask the questions and do the surveys, things like quality of life, the quality of the workforce, free training, infrastructure, that is roads, bridges, as well as the internet, quality of life, and most importantly, schools, K through 12. Georgia has a wonderfully robust university system, and the legislature has done a great job of taking care of that. We have a state-leading technical school cohort, and our Quick Start program is being watched by every other state in the union. It's just a winner. But when it comes to K through 12, we're 49th. That's something that is Roy Fickling says when they do economic development presentations, he'll say, we got a great thing, but we got to apologize for our schools. So we find ourselves going around the state saying, you know, we're a pretty business-friendly state. That's what people are telling us. We've generally adopted as a set of principles the idea that we want to not tax inputs, but tax consumption. The speaker at lunch today was talking about eliminating the income tax. Boy, would I love to do that. It happens to be $7 billion of the $17.5 billion of our revenue sources. The other thing that the legislature has done a great job, and I know some of the people who are here are legislative members, I think has done a great job of managing this state's budget through the worst recession in memory. And I don't know whether you know this, but the state has cut its budget over the last 2 years by almost 25%. I don't know that there are many cities and counties around the state that can say that same thing. And it's not been easy, and I've met with some of these folks many times, and it's difficult to have to go in and just keep cutting, because the revenue shortfall, got to balance the budget. The state is actually not the biggest taker of your tax money. Feds are first, locals are second, state is a distant third. In fact, we're 47th in the nation in state tax revenue per capita. We're 22nd in the nation in local tax revenue per capita. So when people around the state are talking about, you know, fat in the state budget, I just got to tell you, show me $1 of fat in the state budget. There may be some, but not much. I think we're at a crossroads. I think we're coming out of the recession. I believe that too. But at the same time, we were funded $2 billion of stimulus money, and that's gone. And as I read the Moody's and Fitch's and Standard & Poor's reports, we are one of 6 AAA states, by the way. And one of the reasons for that is the rating agencies like the diversity of the sources of income we have. They would like for them to be more stable, and we've got to work on that. But they say if we don't find, the only reason we'd be downgraded is if we don't find the money structurally to replace the stimulus money or to balance the budget through other cuts. That means it's somewhere between $1 billion and maybe $1.5 billion hole that we're going to have to try to fill or reduce spending. So the tax council is looking at all the major chunks: sales tax, income tax, corporate tax. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And some of the other cigarette taxes and motor fuel taxes and the like, but not everything, because some of them just not big enough to make a big difference. The biggest source of revenue for the state, obviously, is income tax. Second is sales, and third is corporate. Actually, corporate isn't third, it's fourth. How many people here know roughly what the state revenue was last year? I know you guys do. Right. I think we took in about $15.5 billion in taxes. And the total budget, I think, was about 17.5. And the other money, of course, was stimulus. So our options are not all that great for the coming year. But we're not quite ready yet to have our recommendations put out. We got 2 clients. One is Casey Cagle, and one is David Ralston. Once I talk to them, I'll talk to everybody else. There's one other, corporate. We have a profusion of sales tax exemptions and tax credits. And one of the things I think you said, Clint, was to try to simplify that and make it easier for people to understand. I'd say the same thing about income tax too. So those will be some of the kinds of recommendations that we'll be making to the legislature for their consideration. And beyond that, I think I've just soon answer questions.
Thanks, AD. The good news is we figured out this morning how we're going to fix education, so we got that taken care of now. Scott?
Hi, I'm Scott Hodge. I'm here from Washington, and I'm here to help. I made the mistake of saying that in a speech in Louisiana once, and they threw things at me. I was fascinated listening to the previous panel, which is all about how to create more entrepreneurship and venture capital in Georgia, but also it eventually came down to a discussion on how to keep it here. And one of the models that was being held up was Silicon Valley. Everybody wants to be like Silicon Valley. I find that kind of interesting too, and having been there many times, and the fact that you can't drive around there is a real downer. But the fact that if you look at where was the last place that Intel built a domestic wafer fabrication plant? It wasn't California. It was New Mexico. You are generally benefiting from the great migration of people from the Rust Belt to the south, so that's a good thing, and you want to take that, use that as your advantage. For those of you who don't know, the Tax Foundation, we're the guys that do Tax Freedom Day every year. That's the day we estimate everyone has worked long enough into the year to pay off their taxes. But we've been around, as Kelly said, since 1937. Our job is to be the authorities on economically sound tax policy and really promoting these 5 principles of neutrality, stability, transparency, simplicity, and the promotion of economic growth. And much of that is in line with the principles that Clint was talking about. Now, as we estimate, or as we look at Georgia's business climate, I got to admit, compared to a lot of states I've been to, this is a tough nut to crack. It's very difficult to look at and find major flaws in your tax system, but there's also very difficult to find really good things either. There's just sort of a blandness of it. As I say here, nothing's terrible, but nothing's stellar. There's no comparative advantage here. And in today's economic climate, especially when you're competing globally, you need something that's going to make you comparatively different from your neighbors, especially when you're facing a neighbor to the south and the north that don't tax income, et cetera. Your state and local tax burden is high relative to the rest of the nation. Your business climate, actually it says here below average. You've moved up since we last ranked the state, so you're now just average. You rely too much on incentives, although maybe not as much as other states. And I think some of the fixes is to bring down both your corporate and personal income tax rates and expand your sales tax base, reducing the amount of incentives, et cetera, and eliminating some of these nettlesome taxes for business, such as the capital stock and inventory taxes. I'm going to do a quick drive-by sort of a 360 review of your tax system. For those of you who are on the panel, may want to cover your ears. You've probably heard this more times than you could care. When the Tax Foundation economists look at a state, we generally look at it in 2 different ways. We look at how much a state taxes, that's your tax burden, and then we look at how a state taxes, that's the structure of your state's tax system. And but with that, we use our state business tax climate index, which I'll talk about in a second. When it comes to the state's tax burden, that's the combination of both your state and local taxes relative to state income. The state has the 16th highest overall tax burden in the nation at about 9.9% of state income. And that actually is much higher than all of your neighbors. North Carolina is right now about the closest to you, but certainly Florida has a really low one. Tennessee's tax burden obviously is really low as well. And then the other neighbors are, well, still well below you. So on that, you score poorly. Now when it comes to the Business Climate Index, of course, if those of you in the back can't really see this, the bottom line here is that we use our state business tax climate index, which is we take 100 different variables within a state's tax system, rank them individually on the corporate income tax, personal income tax, property tax, sales tax, et cetera, and that all tiers up into a national ranking. And here the state ranks 25th. Now this is actually an improvement over last year's ranking. Last year we had you ranking around 29th. And you moved up in the rankings, not by anything that you did, but what other people did badly in changing. So this is like, the good news is that you went up. The bad news is it wasn't of your own doing. So it means, it kind of shows you how mercurial some of these rankings are. That and oftentimes clustering in the middle. A lot of you are so close that some little movement on one state can drop them dramatically in the rankings. But the bottom line is that, well, you're just right there in the middle. Let's look at some of the individual components, and that'll kind of give us a better picture of why you're in the middle. Well, when it comes to the corporate tax, well, you were in the middle. It's very average at 6%. While certainly we can see certain states, the Iowas, Pennsylvanias, Alaskas, and so forth, are really in the stratospheric range. But there are a number of states that don't have an income tax, and some states are actually getting rid of their corporate tax, such as Ohio, and moving toward a gross receipt style tax. That'll be interesting to see how Ohio does. I'm not a big fan of gross receipts taxes. I actually think that's going to be bad for the state, but Ohio's in such a mess anyway, they can't screw it up any worse. Well, no, they could if they became New Jersey, but that's a whole other story. What's important about the corporate tax, and I know a lot of people say, well, it doesn't matter much because it's such a small percentage of your budget, et cetera. It matters economically, and we're seeing, especially on a global level, where there's been so much movement on corporate taxes. Over the past 3 or 4 years, more than 50 countries have cut their corporate income taxes to be more competitive than their neighbors and to the rest of the world globally. The United States has one of the highest corporate income taxes of any industrialized country. Only Japan has a slightly higher corporate tax than we do, but at the federal level, we have the highest corporate income tax of any federal government anywhere on earth. So, state taxes matter. And what we find is there's a linkage between corporate taxes and wages. When you look at a hierarchy of the economics of taxes, which one's the most harmful, which one's the least harmful, studies tend to show that corporate income tax is one of the most harmful taxes for economic growth. Personal income taxes are second most harmful. And why? Because their taxes on capital and income, and capital and income are highly mobile and very, very sensitive to high tax rates. And we did a study last year looking at the 30-year relationship between taxes and wages, corporate taxes and wages, and found that for every dollar that states increased their corporate taxes, wages fell by $2.50 over the next 5 years, and then the reverse is true. When states cut their corporate taxes, wages rose. So if you really care about workers in your state and their wages and their standards of living, cut the corporate tax. On the other business taxes, these are some of those nettlesome ones that we talked about, where you've got your capital stock and inventory taxes. I know that the inventory tax is an extremely sensitive issue because it's the local level, and they're going to hold on to that with every last gasp of their breath. And then some of these other ones, but you ought to really look at reforming these because they compound the negative effects of the corporate income tax. On the individual side, again, you're average. The nice thing is you have a 6% top rate on the individual income. The good thing about this is it's the exact same as the corporate income tax, so you don't see any arbitraging between different business forms as you do in other states like Illinois, which has a really high corporate tax, a really low income tax, and so guess what? They have an awful lot more S corps than they do C corps because people arbitrage those. But nonetheless, it's a very complex system. You have this ridiculous it's not even a progressive rate structure because they have 6 brackets up to $7,000, and those must be a relic from when $7,000 was a lot of money. That should be just done away with and give everybody a tax cut. And we'll talk about cutting the rate here in a second. The sales tax, you may not be able to see this. Of course, you all know that the federal or your state level tax is pretty low at 4%, but it's the average of your local governments that jack up your overall average and make you the 16th highest overall sales tax in the nation. It does harm your index ranking on our scale because local governments have the option to define the base, and that makes it very complicated for businesses to comply with. And also, you apply the sales tax to like utility costs for businesses, and that, I'm sure, is raising their costs as well. And just to get to the conclusion here, I just kind of throw this out. Is there a 4% solution to Georgia's business climate? And one of the things I might suggest is now, ideally, you'd want to get rid of a tax, and God knows I'd agree with Steve Moore any day. You want to get rid of the income tax. I'd prefer getting rid of the corporate tax, but we can flip a coin. That's really hard to do in today's environment. So what I would suggest is moving toward what I call the Utah or Colorado model, and that is take all your rates, harmonize them. You've already done that, so that's a good thing. But just start ratcheting them down. Bring it down to that 3 or 4% level on both. At 4%, I maybe picked out of a hat because it's the same as the sales tax. But the point is to get both of those rates down as low as possible and provide a uniform, across the board, simple system. Get rid of your capital stock and inventory taxes if possible. Do this by expanding your sales tax base. Sales taxes, has been explained here already. The base is far too narrow. There are too many things that are exempt. And you should perhaps even consider expanding it to some services. I know that's a little challenging to define what that means, but that should be the goal. And then get out of the incentive business, as we saw with the federal cash for clunkers business. That was a disaster. Incentives are to a state's economy what steroids are to the human body. They kind of give you a short-term boost, and then eventually they kind of weaken the bones and the muscles and sometimes cause impotence. And then lastly, North Carolina, I just like to see if you're awake. And lastly, North Carolina is sort of the poster child for expensive incentive programs gone wrong. They gave Dell Computers about $285 million to move into the state. Dell closed that factory within 5 years of its opening. So that was an absolute disaster. And lastly, when you're in the middle of the pack, this is kind of the way the rest of the field looks. This is not where you want to be. You know, there'll be a lot of lawmakers who will say, education. We invest more in education, we'll have a better business climate. We don't know the results of higher education spending for about 18 years. And your educated workforce may not stay in the state if there are no jobs. Roads are really great too, but they allow people to flee the state even faster if you don't have jobs for them either. So, but you can fix your tax climate today and be more prosperous tomorrow. Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you, Scott. I know everybody's got a lot of questions. I've got 2 or 3 I'm going to pose to the audience first, panel first. I want to clarify something. What we're talking about today, and I think what the Tax Council is looking at, is tax structure. What you tax and how you tax it, not tax burden, which is the level of taxes. You in the legislature have to take our existing tax structure, and if you don't have enough money, you want to do one of 2 things: raise the rate or broaden the base. So we're talking about structure. And so let me ask you this, Scott. Give me the policy answer, not the political answer. There's the sales tax. Everybody's talking about broadening the sales tax. What is the appropriate, the broadest it could possibly be of the sales tax? How would you define a sales tax base that is the ideal base?
All end goods or services, and exempt all business-to-business transactions. So therefore, you would not sell or you would not tax a ream of paper that a business bought from Staples, but you would tax me on that. You would tax me on the electricity that I buy, but you wouldn't tax the business on the electricity that it uses. Or services would be the same thing. You know, tax me on a haircut the same way that you would tax me on the shampoo that I bought from the stylist. That's the ideal. It's very difficult in practice, especially to tax services. There are all kinds of challenges with that because the plumber will have a cash price and then a sales tax price. This is going to happen no matter what, but that's the ideal.
Well, I think what's important is he did say, excluding business inputs, we do have all these exemptions, and they've been put in haphazardly over the years. I think every legislative session there's some more. What we found out, both academics looking at this and the tax council and presentation, is a lot of them are business inputs that should, from a policy perspective, they should be exempt. We still have sales tax and energy. We have telecommunications inputs that we are taxing incorrectly. We might be able to fix, but I think it's important to keep that in mind. That's why gross receipts tax is so bad, because it taxes everything, and it taxes it multiple times. So a lot of reasons why that's a bad idea. How about the income tax? How do we broaden our income tax base? What is the perfect base there?
Well, you would want to, here's the challenge, because the definition of income is a rather tricky one in economics. Especially economists have really funny notions of what income really is. But on the bottom line is that you want to tax all income and only once, and minimize the number of deductions. So you may want to have a very simple system, one rate, maybe one exemption level or standard deduction, but then no other deductions at all. Nothing for the mortgage interest, nothing for putting new windows in your house, solar panels on your roof, taking care of grandma, putting kids in daycare, all the things that the federal code does so poorly that essentially makes it so complicated and drives all of us to pay someone else to do our taxes.
In fact, there are two states, actually, correct me if I'm wrong, that actually tax federal AGI with no exemptions or deductions, Illinois and Pennsylvania, and that's allowed them to have, what, a 3% rate?
3% rate, and what's interesting, if you look at both of those states, and I've actually talked to legislators in those states, and compare their income tax collections to very highly progressive states, such as New Jersey or California. New Jersey and California have huge roller coaster collections from their income taxes, but both Illinois and Pennsylvania income taxes grow at this very steady state. It's inclining, it's going up with the economy, but it doesn't go through these sort of hyper peaks and valleys, and that's because they have a very flat system with a low rate on a broad base, whereas these highly progressive systems suffer mightily through the peaks and valleys of the economy, and especially because you're taxing high-income people who have highly volatile income, like capital gains, dividends, and business income. So that would be my model, is to move towards something like those two have. Unfortunately, both of them screw up their tax system by having really high corporate income taxes, well above 8%, and as we saw there, 9.9% in Pennsylvania. They should have the same rate on business income, and they'd be really competitive states.
Last question. Broadening the base and lowering the rates as much as possible. I think every economist basically agrees. And I've been on a sort of a tour of the state with Alan Essig, another group who typically not as conservative. And we agree a lot on tax policy because in terms of structure, he agrees a broad base and a low rate is a good idea. However, that also conflicts with what the economists call vertical equity. I think of it as fairness. We talked about it earlier, Clint, you did. Because we have a grocery tax exemption because we don't want low-income Georgians who are spending a disproportionate amount of their income on food to have to pay that extra tax. We have exemptions and deductions to help low-income Georgians. Pennsylvania has put in place a low-income tax credit to offset the lack of some of those exemptions. It seems like that's a more effective way to do that. Georgia, we got rid of our low-income tax credit just this past year. And I believe that was put in when we raised the sales tax back in 1989 to offset the impact on low-income Georgians. So how do you settle it from a policy perspective? We want to eliminate distortions and have broad-based low rate, but we also want to be fair to our low-income Georgians.
Well, this is the great tension, and we're seeing it at the federal level every day. But there is really no reason to exempt anyone from groceries or exempt the sales tax from groceries, in particular because so many low-income people, the ones that we want to help, are already getting food stamps and other public assistance or the earned income tax credit, either at the federal level or the state level. These people are being held harmless largely, and also what you end up doing is you're giving everyone the benefit while you're trying to help a very small group. It's like the flip side of what we try to do to stop teenage drinking. We're going to raise the beer tax. Let's make everyone suffer in order to keep a few teenagers from buying beer. This is kind of a craziness that gets into the tax system when we try to use the tax system for social engineering. Let's keep things as simple as possible. Maybe have some sort of a credit for low-income people. Most of them aren't paying income taxes to begin with, so they are being held harmless, and many of them are getting these refundable credits from the federal government in particular.
Speaking of beer, I think we have the second highest tax on beer in Georgia.
See, there you go.
We're not average.
How many?
there.
But I bet you have very few teenage drinkers, right?
All right, we're going to open it up for questions from the audience. We have about 20 minutes. Now, I know we got some questions out there. Hunter.
Hi, I'm Hunter Hill with the CPLI. I just had a question about our processes as we look at structure. I assume we do studies and things to show lowering these income tax rates for the corporate and the individual. And what has that shown us if we can come up with a revenue neutral solution in Georgia to lower the corporate and income tax rates?
Let me start by commenting on my co-presenters. A lot of what Scott Hodge advocates are forward-thinking ways to go about building a tax rate. The governor is fond of saying we need to do more and more with less and less, and now he's gotten to the point now he's saying we're going to be doing less with less. What we have tried to do is to compare ourselves to the states with whom we compete for business. And one of them is Tennessee. One of them, interesting, is Texas, which was heard about this morning. We don't think we have to go to a zero income tax rate to be competitive with Texas, which has a zero income tax rate. But we'll model out whether how higher we have to take sales tax revenue, one way based or not, to offset income tax losses, because income tax is $7 billion of the $17 billion, or $15 billion that we collect. Interestingly, corporate income tax is only $680 million. It's almost a nuisance in and of itself. So we are trying to see how close we can come to broaden the base and lower the rate. And we model those things out. Where do you have to get the money to make up for the things you cut out? But we're using an iterative process for doing that. Can I answer your question?
I've got a question for you. Clint, there's some people who would say we're missing the collection of a lot of sales tax. You mentioned that a little bit using electronic records. Some people thought there might be $1 billion to solve our budget problem. If we just did a better job of collecting sales tax that is owed at the local level. What do you think? You're close to the ground and talking to a lot of local officials. What's the best solution to better tax collection? Because we're all for fair tax collection, because that means if somebody's cheating and not paying it, that means we all pay more.
I don't think there's $1 billion out there, but we do feel like there's probably anywhere from 5 to 10, 15% at the most, probably, that we could do a better job of making sure that we have procedures in place to audit. Georgia, if you look at other states in the Southeast, we have one of the lowest audit rates of any state. I know that the Department of Revenue recently is in the process of hiring 90 new auditors, which will help. I think at one time we had only 4 auditors for the entire state dealing with convenience stores. How many of you have been in a convenience store and not been charged the right amount of sales tax? Now, I know most of you probably don't even look at your sales tax bill. Wasn't running up, or rung up and pocketed it. We had an issue a few years ago at the General Assembly where they were ringing it up as lottery tickets and pocketing the money. We have a lot of businesses that are unfortunately, it's the smaller ones. It's not your Home Depots and your Walmarts, I don't think, are the problem. It's the smaller ones, which means it's not going to be as much revenue when you get into the small ones. But it does create some equity issues out there. And I think that by having more partnerships between the local and state level, we can get better compliance, because your local folks know what's out there. They have people that go into these businesses on a daily basis. They know if the hair salon that doesn't have a sales tax ID, if they're actually selling shampoo or not. We don't have the state resources to go out and do that. So I think by partnering with the local level, they can then alert, if we have a lines of communication set up with the Department of Revenue, they can then alert the Department of Revenue where we do have problems, where they go out and get that receipt and they see that the sales tax is not being collected. So I think there is some opportunity there. Another thing that we can do, and this has been done on the motor fuel tax, if we can bring the collection point higher up on the food chain. With motor fuel, we now collect at the wholesale level. Some states collect at what they call the rack level. There's less people to deal with. The fewer people that you deal with, the better compliance you get. It's easier to audit a fewer number of people.
Question?
I was just going to add, I agree with you. There's not $1 billion out there.
No.
But the key to this is the degree of cooperation between the Department of Revenue, on the one hand, who has tax records, and the local governments who have business licenses or other databases where you can cross-reference. Both the local and the state people need to be funded, need to be supported to do a better job, and they ought to have people in policy-making positions who want to do a better job of cooperation.
Thanks. Question?
I'm Mike Chokus, the state representative from South Georgia. And Clint, you said something about the small stores not paying their portion of the sales tax, and you touched on a solution that was done by the state legislature a couple of years ago. I think Richard Royal championed that, where the fuel tax, the sales tax on motor fuel, was collected by the distributor and instead of by the individual store. Any thoughts on what we can do that would be similar to that? Because dealing with the wholesalers, most of them are reputable wholesalers, charge that tax to, we would see increases. I think in the motor fuel sales tax, we saw an increase of over 25% the first month. So I'd like your comments on how we could implement something like that.
So you're saying, how can we implement something like that with other types of commodities? Exactly. Well, you really just have to look at each one on a case-by-case basis. I know one of the things that we're looking at HCG is with our 911 fees. We collect those. Every county and city that has a 911 system collects it. And you're dealing with the big companies like AT&T and Verizon, and they don't have the capacity to audit and efficiently collect that. So how can you centralize the collections? At the same time, though, there has to be information sharing. You mentioned the motor fuel tax. We have to be able to go back and evaluate what we've done to see how effective it has been. And unfortunately, in the past, our technology that we've used hasn't provided us the data we need to do a thorough evaluation. So I know that the Department of Revenue, currently with its new integrated tax system, is making progress in that direction. And I think we're going to be able to have a lot more data to look at this. But I think you're going to have to look at each one of these on a sort of a case-by-case basis.
Other questions? While we're waiting on question, AD, could you give us just a quick overview of the time frame for the Tax Council? When are they going to be making their recommendations, and what happens after that?
The legislature passed the law establishing the Tax Council and contemporaneously established a joint committee, Senate and House, and named individuals or named titles of people who will receive a recommendation from us on the first day of the legislative session. And at that point, the committee is generally expected to try to draft legislation conforming to the kinds of recommendations we've made. Then there may be some tweaks or changes in there, but by and large, it's supposed to be consistent with the recommendations. Then the bill, if it's voted out of committee, that committee, and it might not be, is sent to the House and the Senate for an up or down vote. 29 votes in the Senate and 91 votes in the House are what it takes to pass it. And once it's passed, it goes to the governor, who presumptively would sign it if that many people in the legislature supported it, because the alternatives are pretty ugly.
Right. Question over here.
It'll come on? Okay. Ron Ham, Chairman of Brantley County. I worked on the policy subcommittee with ACCG and share certainly what you guys are saying about broadening the base on sales tax and collection issues. We all see that at the local level. But one of the things we talked about in the way of helping reduce the burden and ad valorem taxes, which is something that spans across commercial and residential, was the expansion of user fees and something along the lines of what was done with the garbage collection fee, where you've got the teeth in the collection of that fee, to go against the property. We've got a situation where we've got 15,000 parcels, 8,900 commercial and residential dwellings in our whole county, but we send out our tax bills of 62% of our revenues coming off 31% of our bills. Our ad valorem tax structure was built in a time where the $8,000 ceiling that is there now, which I think somebody mentioned a while ago, a $7,000 number, which was a relic from 1940. I think that $8,000 number has probably been there a while too. But we have a lot of folks in a 25-year-old mobile home that have a brand new $40,000 four-wheel drive truck and a $25,000 car parked in front of it on an acre-and-a-half piece of property that are paying no property taxes. But yet they have 4 kids in the school system. Every time they get drunk, they get a policeman out there. They get an ambulance out there. They want the road paved. But we've got these people who are utilizing the services, and they're not doing anything to help support those services. And my parents are both retired school teachers. They're on fixed incomes. They work. They've got a brick home and 10 acres of land, and they're paying 20 mills. So, again, broaden the base. It's the same thing that you're saying, is broaden the base and lower the rate. So when industry comes to look at Brantley County, I can show them a 13, 14 mil county tax instead of a 18, 19, 20 mil county tax. So I guess my question is your input on that approach. Would it apply to ad valorem tax as well? And to Clint's comment about insurance premiums, the counties have to roll that back. So, we roll back the money we get back on insurance premium tax off ad valorem tax. That was tied to that legislation. Cities don't. Something we probably ought to take a look at. But just the user fees to me is a way to broaden the ad valorem base as well.
Let me add to that. That gets to the question. I know there's been a lot of discussion in Georgia. Most of the sales taxes are limited to capital spending, particularly education. Now we're facing very difficult times. If the voters approve, would it make sense to allow them to delay maybe some of those capital projects and divert that money over to the operating side so we don't have to raise property taxes? And then what kind of precautions for taxpayers would we have to put in place, like a spending limit, to make that happen? What about flexibility? Is something you mentioned, Clint? Nadine, pick in on that.
Well, you're right. A lot of people are sitting on large sums of SPLOST money and other sales tax money that they haven't built the project. We've got counties that have money to build a new jail, but they can't build the jail because they don't have the money to staff the jail. So in those situations, they would like to use some of that money for operations. I think you have to be very careful. Long term, these have been very successful because they're temporary in nature and people know what they're getting. So I think that you'd have to, in some way, go back to the voters to get permission to utilize them for something other than what they originally voted on that revenue to be used for. And I think that you'd have to have some sort of a threshold that you would only use it in emergency type situations. You wouldn't want to just get in the habit of using it for operations. Otherwise, you're telling people every time they go to the polls, if you don't vote for this, we're going to jack your property taxes up. Another thing that's interesting that's being discussed across the state is user fees. And this happened just to me last week. I had somebody call me. They were irate. Their county did away with the ad valorem taxes that they were charging for the fire service and replaced it with a fee that they put on the property tax bill. It was a flat fee of $50 for everybody. And this gentleman called up and he said, they doubled my property taxes. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I was paying $25 a year in property taxes, and now they put this $50 fee on my bill, and now I'm paying twice as much. I was kind of thinking, well, that must be nice to only have to pay $50. But it goes back to this issue about the services that people are receiving. And obviously, when you do flat fees like that, can be very regressive in nature. But we have to look at a mix of what's appropriate as far as fees and property taxes. And one of the problems we have with moving to more fees in Georgia is we don't really have a way to force the collection of those like we do property taxes. And I know people hate the alternative for not paying the property taxes, and some people say that's a real problem, that you could take somebody's property and sell it on the courthouse steps. But there needs to be a way to collect the fees. I think we're going to see more and more of this in the future, that at least counties and cities are going to be interested in moving more away from ad valorem taxes to consumption-based taxes and trying to charge more fees for services.
Eddie, do you want to say?
I would just add, I think that's right. I would just add that a disclaimer, the council is focusing on state tax issues. Real property taxes are a local point. The only thing the state does there is that the Department of Revenue is responsible for maintaining sort of standardization of the digest. The other thing that you mentioned, Scott, was this inventory tax. That's a local tax as well. And in some counties, it amounts to almost 20% of their property tax revenue. So it's sort of, while I would say it's definitely anti-competitive, and if we had a magic wand, we'd say eliminate that. It's not on our menu.
Yeah. I'd like to comment on the business inventory tax. It is a local revenue source. I think it roughly makes about $220 million statewide. We actually had legislation to address this, and it was vetoed by the governor. I thought it was a fairly novel idea in the way we attacked it. You may not be familiar, but in Georgia we have Freeport, which already exempts a lot of the business inventory, and that's the inventory that's held in manufacturing and in distribution. But what we passed a year ago that the governor vetoed was the ability for the local officials to have a local referendum to basically expand Freeport, to exempt all business inventory, up to all business inventory, and it would be a local decision. So I think over time that would solve the issue, because if this is truly an issue of being competitive, then if your neighbor does it but you don't do it, and the growth starts going to your neighboring county, then it sort of forces you to do it. And the same thing happened with the current Freeport exemption. Once counties started passing these Freeport exemptions, all the other counties started passing them because they had to do it to remain competitive. So I think if we gave the locals sort of self-discretion to exempt all business inventory, I think you'd see it go away over time without trying to just do it all at once.
It's novel.
Thanks. With that, we are out of town. Please, out of town. About to get ready to go out of town. Out of time. Thank you for